Well, joining me is Director of OPM, Scott Kupor. Thank you, Scott, for taking the time to chat with us here. And, just about over a month into the job, right?
Yeah.
How have things been going? Are you all settled?
Yeah, I don't know if settled may not be the right word, but I feel like I have a decent handle on the team and kind of what we're going to focus on and where things are going. So yeah, I feel pretty good at this point in time.
We wanted to chat with you. Obviously, we cover the DC region, WTOP, and we cover a lot of federal workers. And so you're essentially the head of the HR arm of the government. And, as we see these numbers come out, I wanted to talk to you a bit about what you're seeing. Obviously, the Trump administration trying to cut down on the federal workforce some. And you've recently talked about some numbers out there, maybe in the hundreds of thousands of jobs being cut. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So what we've said so far is, give you some context, right? So we started the year at roughly about 2.4 million civilian employees, right? So forget about kind of uniformed military right now. That's roughly the workforce. They're obviously not all here in D.C., but my guess is probably more than half of them are in D.C. If we end the year on track, we probably will end up somewhere closer to 2.1 million, so about 300,000 difference roughly. The vast majority of that comes through basically voluntary retirement programs. So you may have heard of the DRP, which was the deferred resignation program. More than half of the total number of people kind of elected to take that. The federal government has something called VERA, VSIF, which, these acronyms are all crazy, but basically also is a retirement type program. So about roughly 75-80% of the total headcount reduction will come from kind of voluntary, and then the remainder will come from some form of RIFs that we did, some forms of probationary employees, but those will be a minority of the amount of headcount.
Is this going to be all done this year? Are we going to see it stretch into next year? What are we thinking there?
Yeah, so in terms of at least the things that the different agencies have identified so far, that 300,000, most of that will be done by end of this calendar year. So the fiscal year, of course, ends September 30th, but there were some people who will probably extend out into December 31st. But the vast majority of those people who have elected to kind of leave will probably be leaving by December 31st. In terms of future actions, the honest answer is, don't know. Obviously, a lot of that will be determined by the president's budget, which the OMB is going through, and they're kind of soliciting feedback now from agencies. So there's not a whole lot of definitive guidance on that yet. But as we get closer into the budget process, I think we'll have a better sense, obviously, where the priorities are for the administration.
Now, do you foresee, I know you talked a bit about this, but will you see a majority of people choosing to leave, or will it be more people caught up in so-called rifts, as we've been hearing about?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, just to make sure we're clear, look, the RIF numbers have been very small, and I don't want to make light of that. Obviously, there's still obviously people who no longer have jobs, but at the end of the day, in terms of the scope of things, the vast majority, roughly 80%, as I said, have been through voluntary. I think it depends. Look, if we have our druthers here at OPM, we'd like to find ways where we can kind of give people the opportunity, if for whatever reason the job is going away or otherwise, or they would prefer to go to something else. We'd certainly prefer to use those mechanisms to do that. But as of right now, there's been no decisions made as to what things may look like. As I said, I think the big question, the big issue that is still to be resolved is as we roll into the 26th fiscal year, what guidance do the agencies get from OMB overall? And then obviously our job, of course, will be to affect that guidance.
So let's talk regionally. The DC region, obviously a lot of federal workers here in the DC region. What are we seeing numbers-wise when it comes to this, the DC region as a whole, Virginia, DC, Maryland?
Yeah, look, I don't have the exact numbers to be totally transparent, but I would say if you look at the distribution overall of people leaving government, it pretty much represents what the geographic distribution is of the federal workers. Again, I don't know the exact number. You may know better than I. I think probably a little bit more than half of the government workers in total are in this region, and the rest are obviously in the field. And so from everything I've seen, I would expect the reduction numbers will basically mirror that distribution.
And, another part of this conversation becomes we've heard that we want to relocate some of the jobs and maybe a certain percentage of those jobs. What are you hearing so far with that when it comes to how many jobs may leave this area? Obviously, an impact on the local region when that happens.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any stated effort to kind of move jobs out of D.C. into other areas. There is, as you know, kind of the opposite, which is the president has said return to office is important. And so what a lot of us went through earlier in the year was looking at people that we had in various field offices and figuring out ways where if people were working from home to get them to return to a field office. So in that respect, actually, I think, I would hope that should be positive from a D.C. metro perspective, which is we ought to have more people showing up at the office every day, which hopefully drives, local restaurants and other things. Obviously, there are consumers of that type of behavior.
All right. Let's talk a bit about the people who unfortunately have been caught up in some of these rifts or just choosing voluntary. separation. We've heard from some people locally who reached out to us saying that the process has been somewhat confusing at times. Sometimes they're not getting responses from OPM when they're trying to figure out, should I take this deal? Or if I was let go, what do I do next here? And so obviously you're new to the job here. So, what is being done to address those concerns?
Yeah, so I have not heard a lot of those concerns, but I believe you when you say that they exist. So number one is, look, obviously our goal is to make sure everybody is treated fairly and has the information they need. So if people aren't getting the information, by all means, please reach out to us. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. In terms of the communications, a lot of the communications went kind of via the different agencies. So we put out a lot of guidance to agencies. It's possible maybe that created confusion where people weren't sure whether to go to OPM or go to their agencies. But I think we resolved those issues. And then the final thing I would mention is just the whole kind of retirement process, which, as you may know, has been a very kind of manual process. We're working on a lot of things that we think will massively improve the efficiency and the user experience there, given that we know we obviously will have a lot of people kind of who've chosen retirement as part of this process. So I think we'll try to be as proactive as we can to anticipate significant volumes of people kind of tapping those resources and making sure they have the relevant information.
And I know you've there's a new program out or new software, or at least an online computerized format for applying for your retirement now. And we did receive a couple people who did say that they felt like the process was rushed and that they just were not able to make it through, and they kind of feel like it's just not working. So is that growing pains, or is that just something we're trying to work through with the systems?
Yeah, look, I think, we're tracking it very, very carefully. Look, with any initial rollout of something, there's always going to be things that we need to address, certainly. So far, at least, though, as we've had issues, we've been able to address them very quickly, and, the system has actually been working, very effectively. So, look, I have no doubt that, people need to get used to a new system. There's always kind of changes that come with that. But I feel very confident that kind of the user interface has been designed and the responsiveness of the team to any concerns is where it needs to be.
Now, for deferred resignation, do you have any advice for people who are, considering those offers and there may be more down the pipeline? Can you talk a bit about what you would tell them if they came up to you and said, what should I consider here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sure I'm not sure I want to be in the business of giving people personal advice because these are very personal decisions. But look, the program, I think, was designed to make it as easy as possible for people to transition and find time if they wanted to do something else, or in some cases, obviously, to fully retire. So as you recall, the program enabled them to go on effectively administrative leave for 8 months, which meant they would be paid at their full rate and they would have no responsibilities to the government during that period of time. So, that was designed to be as generous as we thought we could be, given kind of financial constraints in the government, but also to make sure that people had as much time to offboard, to go look for new opportunities to the extent they wanted to do so. So I think at least, if you look at these programs, particularly as they're designed, in the private sector or otherwise, I think the team that designed those did as much as they could to be appropriately generous and give people as long of a runway as they could to go transition into something new.
Since taking over the helm, how have you, reached out to federal workers? What have you done to try to kind of rally everyone, so to speak, through what we've been going through and what we've seen?
Yeah, so look, it starts here at OPM. So, on my first day, we did an all-hands meeting, and, my message was just really an acknowledgement of the fact that, look, I recognize people have been through, a lot of change, right? There was a lot of things that happened in the first 6 months of this administration, and change is unsettling, which I totally get. And so what I told my team was, I said, look, right now, we need to digest all this change. I told them I was very as truthful as I could be, which is I said, look, there's no plan right now to do any, additional kind of major reductions here. I said, look, I want to be also transparent that I can't make a promise to you that will never change. We may get directives from, kind of the government as to how they want us to handle finances, or there may be other opportunities where we feel like we could do things more efficiently. But I wanted to kind of just communicate as clearly as I could that, we recognize the change people have been through, and that right now our job is to try to come together and figure out how we do things together. So that's kind of been within OPM. More broadly across the agencies, we have something called the Chico Council, which is a group of all of the Chicos, or the HR professionals who are responsible for all the various agencies in government. And that's our primary interface via OPM into the other organizations. And then separately, I've tried to meet as many of the secretaries and others that I could in the agencies and just make sure they know who we are and what we do, how we intend to work with them, and, make sure that we have, a good line of communication there.
So as of right now, obviously we're going back to earlier, but we talked about the 300,000 jobs going. There could be more down the road, but you just don't know at this point is what you're saying.
Yeah, look, I'm not trying to say there could be or there couldn't be. I'm trying to be very transparent, which is a lot of what we don't know yet is how the budget process will play out. So once we understand that, obviously, I'm sure we'll get very clear directive from the president and his management agenda and the OMB, obviously, which is his budget office. and that will help us have a better understanding of kind of what the go-forward plans look like.
All right. And when it comes to morale,
Yeah.
how are you kind of addressing some of those concerns? Of course, we've heard for some people, I went into the job to perform a public service, but also there's that job security that's traditionally come with government jobs.
Yeah.
Do you think that sticks around? Do what some of them are concerned about whether that remains after, with the changes being seen?
Yeah, look, my style is, look, I think when you have times of change, and I've unfortunately had to live through these, throughout my 35-year private sector career as well, I just think you have to be transparent with people. And so what I've told people is said, look, right now, as I mentioned, right now we don't have any plans to do anything, but I also, again, I can't give you a promise that something like that may not change over time. And what I commit is we'll just be transparent on these things. So I recognize that, obviously some people are obviously, concerned about long-term job stability. I totally understand that. And I think the best thing we can do is just demonstrate that we can be effective stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, that we can do the services the way we need to. And look, we'll have a better sense, obviously, at what the macro situation looks like once we get through the full budget process.
And some of the folks we heard from say they felt like in the beginning part of this that they felt vilified in a way due to what the messaging out there at times and maybe the actions. Are you trying to address that when it comes to, answering those concerns when they say, we feel like as federal workers, we've been vilified here?
Yeah, look, I said this actually in my hearing when I went through for confirmation, which is I think you can be firm and still be respectful of the fact that, obviously we're talking about people's livelihood and people's jobs here. And so that's the communication that I want to kind of convey to people is, look, I recognize and understand we're talking about very serious things. Anytime we do layoffs or reductions, that impacts people's families, it impacts people's friends, it impacts their ability to be contributing members to their community. And look, we need to recognize and understand that that is a difficult thing for people to live through. For me, unfortunately, having been through this before, when you're as a manager, when you lay somebody off, you've basically broken trust with them, right? Because you hired them and you told them all the wonderful things that you could do for their career by doing this. And now we're saying, look, through no fault of your own, unfortunately, we have to eliminate this job. And so I think you can be both empathetic and also be firm and direct the organization in the right direction.
And just over a month in, what are some of the changes you see that are needed as you move forward here?
Yeah, look, the biggest things I've seen are, I would kind of bundle a lot of them into what I would call kind of cultural change in the organization. So I'm obviously a new observer to this, but I think if you look generally, historically in government, budgets typically have only gone in one direction, which is they typically kind of increase from year to year. And as a result, I think people get used to that. And what I want to change is I want people to think of themselves ultimately as we are stewards of taxpayer dollars. And so our job is not only to do a good service on behalf of the taxpayers, but also, to me, operational efficiency needs to be a continuous improvement process. So it's not, we don't just, reduce headcount at one point in time and kind of clap our hands and say, we're done with that. We need to actually incorporate it into how people think about it. So the culture that I'm trying to affect here at OPM that I hope we will be able to convey across the government is everybody in every organization should always think about, like, could I do things differently? Could I do things better? Are there ways to use technology? Are there ways to change the organization? Are we working on the right things? So we've got to ruthless and prioritize things in a fixed environment. And there may just be some things that we've done for 20 years, but, don't add the kind of utility anymore that we think they do. So we've got to kind of be able to think from first principles in that respect. And that's probably the biggest thing that I'm trying to, convey as I talk to the team here, and that I'd like to see us embed into our performance.
Finally, any message out there to federal workers who may see this and others who are watching and learning as you take the helm?
Yeah, look, I think the big thing we've touched on, which is one is, look, I just think what I hope to bring to government, having spent, my whole career in private sector, is maybe just a different way of looking at things. And I'm a very simple person when I think about organizations. At the end of the day, to me, organizations are collections of people, and people respond to the incentives that those organizations provide them. And what I would like to see in the government is just a change in incentives. So instead of us thinking about the incentive always being how can we grow our budget or how can we add, to things, I want us to think about the incentives as, we should be stewards of taxpayer dollars and think about operational efficiency and how we spend money in a new light. And look, I'm going to try to do this in a, try to be, communicative, try to be, open with people. And, I recognize obviously that, times of change are unsettling, but I hope we'll get through this. And what will come out of it is, a continuously robust workforce.
Now, do you hope to bring more private sector principles into government jobs when it comes to how how positions are selected and how changes are made?
I mean, yes and no. So I come from the private sector, so maybe people will think differently, but I think many of the principles I think work whether you're talking about the private sector or you're talking about government or you're talking about, even the nonprofit sector, which is what do we want to accomplish as an organization? And those things may be different. So certainly the private sector has a profit motivation, which is very different. And we've got different objectives in the public sector. But I think the things that matter fundamentally are, do people have an environment where they can come to work every day, they feel like they can learn, they work for a manager who cares about their development, they have career development opportunities, they're given an opportunity to innovate and take, appropriate levels of risk, because again, we're in government here, we can't do the kinds of risks that we do in the private sector. That, I think, is what's universal across organizations. And so I think if we can just incorporate those kind of, pieces of culture, then I think the question then we just have to decide is, okay, like, what are the core objectives that we want to accomplish? But the underlying culture, the underlying incentives, the underlying objectives, I think actually can align very closely across different organizations.
All right, well, Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.